Hello everybody. In this video I'm going to talk about physiological tracings or drug tracings. They appear frequently on step 1 exams and also other exams because they test your knowledge of autonomic physiology and pharmacology and how you apply it. Usually they're given in an X-Y-X format. So you have to figure out two unknowns, X and Y. And what you're given is their effect on blood pressure and heart rate, for example, as I've drawn here out. So usually X is the agonist. So what is an agonist? An agonist is a drug or molecule that binds to a receptor and has an effect. So you can think about it like the agonist being a key and the receptor being a lock. So the key fits into the lock, but you can also turn the key. So let's say the door is going to open and people can go in or ions can flow in. So it has an effect. And you can also see clearly here X is given and you see an effect on heart rate and also on blood pressure. But usually X is pretty short-lived and it wears off. So you can see here that after a while you get back to baseline. Then an antagonist is typically given. So an antagonist is any drug that binds to a receptor but doesn't do anything. So it just sits there. So you can think about it again like a key for the antagonist fitting into the lock, but now you cannot turn it. So an antagonist does not have an effect on its own. It always depends on its surroundings. If there are other agonists, for example, around that would like to fit into this lock. Now you can see here that the antagonist is given, and then usually the agonist is given again. The antagonist is lasting usually for the experiment. So as a last thing, what you're going to get is you get the agonist in the presence of the antagonist, and that can give you the final clue kind of how to solve this little application exercise in terms of figuring out these two unknowns. So now I just want to give you a very specific order in how to approach these physiological tracings. So the first thing what I would recommend is looking at the diastolic pressure. So right here, what does this drug do to diastolic pressure? So a major determinant of diastolic pressure is systemic vascular resistance. Because if the systemic vascular resistance is very high, it's going to be harder for the blood to flow from the arteries to the arterioles. And therefore blood pressure doesn't decrease as much during diastole. So how could a drug affect systemic vascular resistance? So let's look at a smooth muscle and let's see which receptors are there and how could they be affected by drugs. So one receptor that sits on the smooth muscle that definitively is going to determine systemic vascular resistance is the alpha-1 receptor. So the alpha-1 receptor is a GQ-coupled receptor, and when you stimulate it, it leads to smooth muscle contraction. And there's definitively a lot of innervation here because we know that our blood vessels are under pure sympathetic control. So there's nerves coming down here, sympathetic nerves, releasing norepinephrine, and that can stimulate also the alpha-1 receptor. Another receptor that sits on the smooth muscle is the beta-2 receptor. The beta-2 receptor is GS coupled, and if you stimulate it, it leads to smooth muscle relaxation. Now, the beta-2 receptor is functionally non-innervated. So no matter if norepinephrine comes down there, it's not going to bind to it because the affinity of norepinephrine to beta-2 is basically 0. So what activates beta-2 receptors physiologically? It's epinephrine. So epinephrine has a very high affinity to beta-2. Epinephrine is made from the adrenal medulla and then travels through the blood and can reach then the beta-2 receptor through the blood. So it acts as a hormone. So now what other receptors sit on the smooth muscle? I hope you're going to say, well, the M3 receptor. The M3 receptor is also GQ coupled and therefore will also lead to smooth muscle contraction. But remember, we have also M3 receptor on the endothelial cells. They're also GQ coupled, but when you stimulate them, this leads to the induction of eNOs, endothelial NO synthase, and you're going to get the NO, the gas. And this is actually going to lead to smooth muscle relaxation. So you can already see here, well, we have actually two opposing effects. M3 receptors will lead to contraction and relaxation. So what is the winner? Well, you have to know that the winner, if you stimulate M3, is gonna be a relaxation, because it turns out that just the NO effect is a stronger one. So now let's discuss how you could activate actually this M3 receptor. That's a very interesting point, because we have this M3 receptors here, but remember, the blood vessels are under pure sympathetic control. So there's actually no innervation of these receptors. They are purely non-innervated. So very importantly, under physiological conditions, you cannot stimulate these receptors. And in addition, acetylcholine is also not acting as a hormone. It's not floating around like epinephrine. So if you would measure acetylcholine in blood, it's always going to be 0. So there's no way you can stimulate these receptors under physiological conditions. Now, why do we have them there and why do we care? Well, we don't know exactly why we have them there, but we know that drugs can stimulate them. And so if you give a muscarinic agonist, for example, those could stimulate them. Or if you inject acetylcholine, it could stimulate it. But you're going to get this effect, the endothelial effect. This is the endothelial cell, is going to be the winner via NO. So the second thing you should look at is the pulse pressure. Here the pulse pressure is the difference between the systolic and the diastolic pressure, if that changed from before the drug was given to after the drug was given. What is a major determinant of pulse pressure? It's going to be the inotropic state, contractility, the ventricular myocytes, how forcefully they can contract. If you now say, well, isn't a stroke volume also a major determinant of pulse pressure? Absolutely correct. Stroke volume is also a determinant of pulse pressure, and it is influenced by heart rate, inotropic state, preload and afterload. It just turns out when we look at these physiological tracings, how drug affects pulse pressure, those all effects tend to cancel each other out. Therefore, we're only going to look at inotropic state to make it a little bit more easy, because when the drug affects inotropic state, and I go even one step further, particularly through the beta-1 receptor, which sits on the ventricular myocytes, then there is mainly an effect on pulse pressure. And you should also remember that the ventricular myocytes are under more or less pure sympathetic control. There's very little parasympathetic innervation. So the third thing that we're going to look at is the mean arterial pressure. And that's easy because we have just the formula is diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of pulse pressure. So we already talked about diastolic pressure and pulse pressure, so we can kind of conclude by the other determinants how mean arterial pressure is going to be doing. The last thing what we're going to look at is heart rate. So heart rate is probably the most difficult to predict, because heart rate is going to be affected by direct effects of the drug, but also by indirect effects of the drug, and thinking about the baroreceptor reflex. So let's first look at our SA node, and let's think what receptors are there that could influence the heart rate. So this is our SA node, and hopefully you remember that heart rate is determined by phase force load. So it's going to be determined by the HCN channel that lets in sodium, that's HCN, but also by LTCCs, by the calcium channels. What receptors sit on the SA node that can affect those channels? Well, one receptor is definitively the beta-1 receptor. It's GS coupled, so you're going to get increased cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is going to definitively activate this HCN channel, because HCN even stands for hyperpolarization cyclic nucleotide sodium channel. So obviously this is a cyclic nucleotide. It activates it. It has already in its name. Cyclic AMP can also activate protein kinase A, and protein kinase A can then activate L-type calcium channels. Now another receptor that sits on the SA node is the M2 receptor. And the M2 receptor is GI coupled. So it actually does exactly the opposite. So you're going to get decreased cyclic AMP, which is going to inhibit this HCN channel, And via the inhibition of PKA, we're also gonna get a decreased activation of the L-type calcium channel. So these are direct effects on the SA node. And we have innervation, parasympathetic and sympathetic. And the rest, the parasympathetic is stronger. And so we're gonna have here, these nerve terminals are gonna secrete acetylcholine and norepinephrine here on the sympathetic side. And then obviously there's also preganglionic fibers as well. And I'm just gonna put them in here because we can put in here the receptor NN, which sits in peripheral ganglia. And that's gonna be a very important receptor, particularly if we're thinking about the baroreceptor reflex. Because I told you already before, the heart rate is gonna be determined by direct effects. And that's kind of easy because it's just the beta 1 receptor and the M2 receptor, but then also the indirect effects. And that's going to be our baroreceptor reflex. Because remember, when the mean arterial pressure is going to drop, who's going to pick that up? The baroreceptor and the aortic arch and the carotid sinus are going to pick this up. There's less stretch, so there's going to be less nerve traffic via cranial nerves 9 and 10 to the NTS. And the NTS does its magic. When there's a blood pressure falling, the NTS will say fire sympathetic and withdraw parasympathetic.